is there, is there indeed a reliable system that when we do something good, there are good consequences. When we do something bad, there are negative consequences. And it really impacts on this whole issue of, is there justice in the universe? I want to just recount one story. Susie had a cousin, he's since passed away. He was a very distinguished individual who was a diplomat in the diplomatic corps of Israel. And he actually wrote a book about his experiences as he was quite young, a teenager in the time of the Shoah. And his father was the Av Beit Din of Warsaw. Now, that was no small position. It wasn't the chief rabbi, but the Av Beit Din of Warsaw, which, as you know, at the time may have had the largest population of Jews of any city in the world. And the two of them were sent together to the concentration camps. And he basically helped to keep his father alive for most of the time that they were in the camps. But unfortunately, his father passed away in his arms, saying Shema Yisrael. And he ultimately survived. He made it to Israel. And when he came to Israel, although, and it was quite shocking to me to hear that his father had this tremendously prestigious position as one of the leading rabbis in Warsaw, which, as I said, is very impressive. But he decided that he would leave religion altogether, that he said, if there's no justice in the universe, if this could happen to my father, who is such a sainted person and such a holy person, then what is the point? And he wrote a book about it, etc. And it was a very fascinating book. And we had a lot of discussions. And I said to him at one point, what would your father have said? Would your father have wanted you to stop being a religious Jew? And we went back and forth on this whole issue. And I'm not trying to solve the issue of justice and this whole concept of tzaddik baralo v'rasha v'tovlo vis-a-vis the Holocaust, because that's really sacred ground and you're really not going to come to any conclusions. But I want to explore with you a little bit from the sources about this whole idea of justice, trying to reconcile an all-powerful, merciful God with some of the, what we would certainly consider negative, terrible things that happen in the universe, and try to retain this faith we have in Hashem. So the first thing I want to look at is this week's Parsha. We're all familiar with the Shema. The first portion of the Shema was in last week's Sedra Vet Hanan. The last portion is in Shlach, and the middle portion is in this Parsha of Akev, which near and dear to me is it's my Bar Mitzvah Parsha. And we're all familiar with this section. We say it every day, twice a day, both morning and evening. And it seems to indicate a very clear correlation between what we do and the response to it. We know it, but let's say it again. If you will keep the mitzvot, lavat Hashem, to love God, ulavdo, to serve God, b'chol levavachem u'b'chol nafshechem, if you will do that, then the results will be very palpable. V'natati mitartzachem b'ito yorel makosh, says Hashem, I'll see to it that you have rain in its proper season. And rain, of course, is the source of prosperity. If you have rain, I mean, there are other things in this world that are valuable, but nothing's more valuable than your food source. The ability, you can't drink oil or eat diamonds. You need food. And that's always been a metaphor for prosperity. And if it rains, you will be able to have harvests of grain and wine and oil. You will be able to raise animals because you will eat and you will be satisfied. That's if you keep the mitzvot. But if you don't, if sartem v'avadatem Elohim acherim, if you serve other gods, and you don't do the mitzvot, then atzarat hashamayim v'lo yeh matar. Then the pasuk says clearly, God will turn off the faucets in the heavens. The skies will no longer produce rain, lo yeh matar, and then everything that flows from it then will result. And obviously, once you have a lack of sustenance, then essentially you can't survive. So it seems like the pattern is being set up very clearly that there is a system of reward and punishment. Do the mitzvot, you prosper. Don't do the mitzvot, then all the negative consequences follow. You can starve, you'll be exiled from the land, etc. So the implication is that this is our guiding principle. However, we see when we examine other sources, and I'm going to take a few from Pirkei Avot. Pirkei Avot says this is not something we ought to be concentrating on. If we do mitzvot, we shouldn't have any concern about what's going to come from those mitzvot. There is really no point in connecting reward or action and reward, or inaction or wrong action and punishment. Let's take a look at them. First of all, in the first parak, already beginning of Pirkei Avot, Antigonus and Shimon HaTzadik state their case, and they say, Al tiyu kabadim hamisham shin et harav al manat lekabel pras. Do not do mitzvot like a servant who is looking for a reward. Elahavik avadim, you can be a servant to Hashem. Hamisham shin et harav shelo al manat lekabel pras. Do it not for the sake of any kind of reward. Just simply do it. Okay, that statement would seem to indicate one direction. However, not everybody agrees. Says, let me find it. In the second parak, the 7th Mishnah, turning a page or two. This is a famous cryptic statement that comes from Rab Chananya ben Akashia, who says, I'm sorry, wait a second. No, let me quote it right. I'm sorry, from Hillel, who says in Aramaic, Hu ra'ag gulgolet achat shetzafal pnei hamayim. He saw a skull floating on the waters. Amarla, and he spoke to the skull, very kind of macabre Mishnah, and said, Al da'at heft atfuch. Because you drowned others, so you were drowned. V'sof mitayfayich yitufun. And whoever drowned you will himself be drowned. So says Hillel, there is a clear connection with the actions that we do and what results from it. Okay, let's look at another in the same parak in the 20th Mishnah. Rabbi Tarfon says, Hayom katsar v'amalacha meruba. The day is short, the work is great. Hapoalim atzelim, the workers are lazy. Hasachar harbe, but there is great reward for everything you do. Ubala bait ochek, and God is insistent. The balabait is insistent. Well, there it seems like reward is indeed part of the process. In the next Mishnah, he adds the famous statement and song, Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor, v'lo ata ben chorin li batel mimenu. There is work to be done, You don't have to do everything, but you have to do your share. Im lamadata Torah harbe, and if you learned a lot of Torah, notnim lecha schar harbe, you're going to get a lot of reward. V'neman hu ba'al malachtecha, because God is very faithful. Sheyishalem lecha schar pu'ulatecha, he will reward you for everything you do. V'da, he adds, shematan scharan shel tzadikim la'atid lavo. With this one rejoinder and this one clarification, remember that the reward of tzaddikim is for the next world. Let me add one more statement from Pirkei Avot in the 4th parak, in the 11th Mishnah. Rabbi Yonatan Omer, Kol Mekayim et Torah me'oni, sofo l'kaima me'osher, v'chol mevatel et Torah me'osher, sofer l'batla me'oni. If you keep the Torah when you're poor, in the end, you will end up rich. And if you don't keep it when you're rich, you will end up poor. So we see a smorgasbord of opinion that seems to discuss, is there a reward or not? And is there a quid pro quo for every action we take? Now, most of us have unfortunately witnessed or experienced difficult, sad, even tragic situations. And we ask ourselves, well, is this deserved? Is this an appropriate response to the way we lived? The way and the accomplishments and the chesed and the good deeds that a person does during his or her life, are we in the end getting our just rewards or our just punishments? And this is important because, as I said in the story at the beginning, if somebody comes to the conclusion that life is not fair, that there is no justice, it calls into question all of these grand statements that say, do the right thing, you'll be rewarded. Keep the mitzvot and you'll have reign and prosperity. And if you don't, then these negative things will happen to you. What about the good people we see that suffer? What about the people we judge to be not good who seem to prosper? So there are a number of different responses to this. One response is, do we really know who's a tzaddik and who's a rasha? In fact, we don't know the value of mitzvot. And this is something, another Mishnah, right? That you don't know the schar of a mitzvah. You have no idea, even though we have our certain big mitzvot, Shabbat and Limud Torah and things that we judge to be most important. Not necessarily. There's many statements in the Gemara about little things a person does that itself merits olam haba. For example, if you say Modim de Rabbanan and you thank God in this small little tefillah in the middle of the Amidah, you'll have a place in olam haba. The story in the Gemara about Rav Yeshua ben Levi who meets Eliyahu and says, who in this marketplace will be going to olam haba? And Eliyahu points to a certain person, and Rav Yeshua ben Levi sees a man. He's standing up on a soapbox, and he's like a comedian making people laugh. And Eliyahu says, if you make people laugh and smile and happy, you have a place in olam haba. Maybe that same person, who knows what other things they did. So it's very difficult to judge and to understand who is righteous, who is not, from that point of view. The other spin on that whole idea is that Hashem rewards and punishes everything that we do because every action has a reaction. So if you see a quote unquote tzaddik, although you don't really know, we shouldn't even use that term. Who knows who's a tzaddik? As I've said before, if you go up to somebody on the street and ask him, are you a tzaddik? If he says yes, he's probably not one. So you really don't know who a tzaddik is. But if you think somebody's a tzaddik and that person's suffering, then according to Chazal, well, they may have done certain things wrong. And since the greatest reward comes in Olam Haba, so Hashem is making this person pay his debt in the currency of this world, so he'll be free and clear in the next world. And conversely, if there's someone who is a Rasha, who maybe did some things right, but who doesn't even believe in Olam Haba, so then God says, okay, I'll pay you in the currency of this world, and then you'll have little or no Olam Haba where things are really valuable. So Chazal obviously are struggling with the same question about justice, about reward and punishment. A couple of other ideas. And I would tell you, by the way, that this controversy and this quandary over the issue of justice is nothing new. Moshe Rabbeinu also tried to come to grips with it in this famous story where he is put in the cleft of the mountain and God shields him with his hand, quote unquote. This is what we read, for example, on Pesach, in the Torah reading of Pesach. And it's appropriate there because Moshe turns to God and says, Hareini nat kavodecha, show me your glory, which Chazal say means that Moshe said, I don't understand the whole system of justice in this world. I witnessed the period of slavery where people were tortured, where babies were put into the wall when they didn't collect enough bricks, and people suffered terribly. How can I reconcile this with a just God? So Hashem basically says these very cryptic words that you will see my back at Achorai, ve Adam lo roed panai v'chai. No man can see my face and live, which Chazal interpret to mean, in retrospect, when you look back at something, you will be able to have a better perspective than when you see it as it's happening. As it's happening, it seems to be unjust and seems to be disconnected from any kind of heavenly, divine sense of right and wrong. And according to a midrash, at this point, God showed him a kind of picture. And he showed a young boy, he showed a man on horseback who was riding and who dropped his wallet. And a boy walked by, picked up the wallet, opened it, and it had gold coins in it. So Moshe said, I don't understand. That doesn't seem just. Person lost their wallet, somebody else found it who didn't own it. So Hashem said, let me play back the whole picture. And he shows, we would say today, a video. He rewinds the video to show that this person on horseback had actually beaten the boy's father and then left him lying there, bruised and beaten, and rode away. Later on, at some point, he would lose this wallet with his gold in it, and the boy would find it. Ki'ilu, that there was some sense of balancing the scales. Hashem is trying to say that you can't necessarily see things in real time and be able to judge whether there's justice, whether there's reward and punishment. And indeed, one of the interesting explanations to try to reconcile this issue is that sometimes justice occurs over the course of a long period of time. It may very well be that the good things, and especially in terms of reward, punishment is, God is more merciful when it comes to punishment and much more generous when it comes to reward. And some of the good things we have may be the result of something one of our grandparents or great-grandparents did, somebody we don't know. How many of us know past our grandparents or maybe our great-grandparents? We don't know much about their life. And maybe they did certain things that ultimately the reward would come in future generations, or maybe something our great grandchildren will do is something that we already are being rewarded for, because God exists in all the dimensions. In right, Zchut Avot, God is existing in the past, present, and future, and maybe he's balancing all of that out for reward and also for punishment. We already know that there is this system of, as we say in the Yud Gimel Midot, Poked Avon Avot, Al Banim Val Bnei Vanim. So this is already stressing the idea that the concept of reward and punishment is not necessarily immediate, but it's spread over time. And we aren't privy to that because we can't see the future. We can maybe look back, but we still don't know. And how far back can we look? So we are part of a continuum, and maybe there we find the issue of justice. There's a balancing of accounts, but it's not visible to us. Someone to say that we don't really understand reward or punishment. Sometimes punishment is actually for our own good, that maybe it's a warning, it's a wake-up call that's going to help us in the future. And sometimes reward isn't all that rewarding. Some people would say, give a teenager or an 18 or 20-year-old $1 million and tell him spend it any way you want is a recipe for disaster. So it's sometimes hard to tell what is reward and what is punishment. There's an interesting comment that we know we're now in the Shemitah year. So when Shemitah was kept as stringent as the Torah talks about, and people went 2 years, sometimes part of a third, without growing anything. So the Torah understands that this is not going to be a simple survival. And people are going to complain. Where are they going to get enough food to last the 6th year, the 7th year, and well into the 8th year? So the pasuk says that if you will cry out to me, Hashem says, I will give you a extra harvest, a more bountiful harvest, so that it'll carry you through till the next time you can grow your crops. So Chazal ask, okay, that's if you cry out. What if you have more faith and you don't cry out? Then what is the reward? Very beautiful idea that the reward is that the crops will be the same in the 6th year of a Shemitah year as it would be any other time. You would not have a triple harvest. You would have a regular harvest, but you will be able to survive on that as if it was 3 times as great as it is. In other words, the blessing will be in your stomach and not in the silo, so that you will be able to survive even on what you might consider a normal harvest without having to do the work of harvesting a triple amount of produce, which is a great deal of work. So somehow you'll survive, and you won't even perhaps realize the blessing that you've been given. And many times blessings come upon us and we don't even know that what we have. We don't appreciate what we have. We don't realize the things that we're given that maybe we don't totally deserve, but we've done some good things that Hashem is repaying us. One more concept and idea. We said before that the rabbis were very, very agitated over this whole discussion of reward and punishment. And so, as we saw earlier, they came up with this concept that you have to factor in Olam Haba, that you can't, with all the different explanations we've talked about, at some point you may very well throw up your hands and say, this can't be just, this can't be right. this is some skewed idea of reward and punishment, unless and until you add Olam Haba. And this is the famous story. There's one most famous story of all, and that's the story of Acher, Rabbi Elisha ben Avuya. You can read the book As a Driven Leaf, which is a beautiful, well done book based on this story of Acher, who lost his faith in God, specifically because of two incidents. And there are two stories about him. The first one, I think most people know, and that is that he witnessed a father tell his son, climb that tree and shoo away the mother bird. Now, following your father or parents' command is kibbud av v'aim, which is there are 3 mitzvot in the Torah that promise long life. A lot of people think it's 2, but it's really 3. One of them is kibbud av v'aim. So he followed his father's order. He went up the tree. Shiluach hakein, sending away the mother bird before you take the baby birds, the eggs, that's also rewarded with long life. And the boy falls out of the tree. And Rabbi Elisha ben Avuya says, here I witness a boy fulfilling 2 of the 3 mitzvot that promise long life, and he falls to his death. Ein din ve'ein dayan. There is no law and there is no judge in this universe. If that's true, then somehow there can't be a God if this kind of thing happens. The other story that's brought in Kiddushin is somewhat similar, and it talks about in the Asar Haruge Malchut, one of the sages who was murdered by the Romans was Chitzpit HaMeturgaman. He was a rabbi who was famed for, in the old days, when people didn't have Sidurim or Chumashim, especially Chumashim, they would read a portion of the Torah, and then somebody would get up to translate it so the regular people could understand it and explain it. And he was very gifted. He was world famous for his art in being able to tell and explain the Torah. The Romans captured him, also on the pretense that he was teaching Torah, and he was tortured, and they cut his tongue out as a kind of a grotesque way of, before murdering him, because he had this golden tongue. And then they threw it into a garbage heap, and a pig came along and ate the tongue. And this Elisha ben Avuya witnessed, and the same result that we heard before. He said, Ein din ve'ein dayan. There is no judge, there's no law, there's no purpose or sense to the universe. And he became heretical, and he refused to believe in Hashem. And there's a whole continuing story about him, although he was a great sage. And the Gemara there concludes, the Gemara in Kiddushin, that a statement by his own grandson, who said he didn't realize that reward doesn't come in this world. It's reserved for the world to come. And so Chazal want to factor that in as well, and want to say that at some point, when we realize that we simply can't see everything happening, and we can't reconcile this seemingly contradictory idea of V'haya im shamoa, if you listen, you'll be rewarded. If you don't, you'll be punished. That ultimately there will be a balancing of the books, but it might only come in Olam Haba. I don't think we really ever come to a conclusion about this. I think human nature tends, whenever we experience something negative, doubt enters our mind, and we wonder, is there really a guiding hand to this universe, to life? Is it being parceled out justly and appropriately? when things, on the other hand, when good things happen to us, we generally tend to almost take it for granted. The truth is that when life happens normally and you wake up in the morning and you have a new day of life and you don't experience disaster and things run normally, that really is where you should make the blessing. Not wait till something extraordinary happens. The fact that we can have a normal existence is, I think, the greatest bracha of all, especially in Israel. If you, and I don't say that only kiddingly, that when things work in Israel, when you don't have a hafsakat chashmal every day, when somehow we're able to get through the day and survive all these crises that we face, the truth is that may be a tremendous source of reward and Hashem already doing something good for us. And ultimately, we look back at life and we should be able to see the blessing much more than we see the punishment, hopefully. But if we ever have a doubt, we reserve this idea that says, okay, we can't see it. It may be something spread across the generations. And at the end of the day, if it's not somehow reconciled, it will be in Olam Haba. So I will stop here. And if we have the ability to unmute, then anybody wants to make a comment, you can do so. Somehow my screen is a little bit messed up there, but okay. Anybody want to contribute anything? Thank you. Can you unmute yourself? Yossi, what do you think?
Yes, they can.
Okay.
Yes, they can.
So if anybody would like to say something, feel free to unmute. You know, we had a few statements here made on the chat. And yeah, we talked about Zchut Avot. All right, anybody else want to add anything? Okay, if not, I will wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom. You should only experience bracha and be able to see it as well. And hopefully we shall maintain our faith and not have to wait for Olam Haba to appreciate what we have. Shabbat Shalom. And
Shabbat Shalom.
next week,
Thank you, Rabbi Weiss.
Thank you. All the best.